Hello everyone, and welcome back to Ben Plays Games. Grand Theft Auto 1 and 2 were pretty good fun. Known for their top-down gameplay and newspaper headline-provoking violence, they were notorious not only among gamers, but the wider public as a whole, although as games, they weren't considered to be anything more than reasonably entertaining. That is, until Grand Theft Auto 3 came along in 2001. One of the most influential video games of all time, Grand Theft Auto 3 was a game so good, so revolutionary, that the series soon became well known not only for its more controversial elements, but on its own merit as part of gaming history as well. And in my view, that's predominantly down to its open world. It was something unlike anything gamers had seen before, presenting a huge open city that felt like a massive technological leap forward, but at the same time, grounded. It was a world that felt believable, a world that felt lived in, a world that if left to its own devices felt a little boring. And that's something I think deserves to be further discussed. If you enjoy the video, do consider hitting like and subscribe, it would make my day. And now, let's start with a quick look at the context around Grand Theft Auto 3's release. While Grand Theft Auto 3 is certainly one of the most memorable open world games, it would be entirely incorrect to say that Grand Theft Auto 3 was the first open world game. One of the earliest, most popular examples is the BBC Micro's space simulator Elite, released in 1984, with games in the Legend of Zelda series, Driver, Shenmue, and of course the two previous games in the Grand Theft Auto series, for example, all featuring their own open worlds. Perhaps the game closest to doing what Grand Theft Auto 3 did prior to its release was 1999's Driver, which featured its own open world and criminal underworld plot, and 2000's Driver 2, which took the open world formula Driver had established, but also allowed main character Tanner to actually leave his car and roam on foot. You might be wondering at this point, if there were so many games that featured elements of GTA 3 in one form or another to begin with, why it has any right being described as a revolutionary title. Well, that's because until the release of the PlayStation 2 in the year 2000, there had been no game which managed to bring the different ideas these other titles offered together in one cohesive, real-world package. Elite and The Legend of Zelda featured open worlds, but they weren't the worlds gamers lived in. Driver 2 let you explore a real city in car and on foot, but there wasn't a whole lot to do outside of the driving-based missions. Grand Theft Auto 1 and 2 offered more exciting on-foot action, but the top-down view made players feel detached from the street-level experience. And finally, Shenmue nailed the feeling of being part of a living, breathing town, but was limited in terms of scale. All these titles used their open worlds fantastically in their own special way, but none of them brought everything together in quite the same manner that Grand Theft Auto 3 did. It featured an open world like Elite and The Legend of Zelda, games that arguably popularised the idea, but in a far more grounded setting. It took place in a fully 3D city like the two Drivers, but at the same time expanded upon the more robust on-foot options offered by Grand Theft Auto 1 and 2. Its open world felt like a city people actually lived in, one you were simply a resident of, like Shenmue so wonderfully managed with Yokosuka. The beauty of Grand Theft Auto 3 was that by learning from games like the ones I've just talked about, its own open world of Liberty City became the strongest foundation for true sandbox gameplay anyone at the time had experienced. Liberty City felt alive, but realistically so, outside of the story at least, with pedestrians doing absolutely nothing out of the ordinary the majority of the time. As far as the player was aware, they were just going about their daily business. It's the same with the vehicles on the city's streets. Most of the time they'll be calmly driving down the road without committing so much as a parking offence. The city itself too is no more exciting or glamorous, bar a few areas. Much of its locales are fairly drab, fairly grey and fairly dirty. Claude, 3's mute protagonist, even begins the game living out of a miserable looking single room in a dingy looking alley in a rough part of town. None of it is overly exciting. And the game, in its own way, continues to encourage the player to experience this normality too. You have to drive to missions, for example, in order to begin them. In Liberty City, days became nights which became days again. The weather regularly changed. If you decided you wanted to break the law, the police would respond appropriately. Should someone end up getting hurt, an ambulance would arrive. And even the many different radio stations featured, incredible in their own right, would reference events that happened in-game. The fact that Liberty City wasn't an extravagant over-the-top place at first glance, that at any time you could get out of your car, walk down the street and most likely absolutely nothing would happen, is by far the game's greatest strength. It is, still at its core, a game, granted. There are missions, there's a story, and it can eventually be completed. But for the first time, gamers were experiencing a three-dimensional open world that was boring, but in the best way possible. The city was essentially a canvas, and the player, the artist, colouring this blank slate with whatever actions they chose to take. By using parts of some of the games I've already mentioned, and parts from others besides, Rockstar created a world that, at the time, was the closest mirror to our own you could possibly find. Gamers were able to explore a city in 3 dimensions that felt truly familiar, one that also responded appropriately and predictably to their actions. That may not sound on paper as exciting as travelling through galaxies unknown in Elite or exploring Hyrule in Zelda, but what it did do is serve to amplify the feelings of agency players experienced, especially when they decided to do something out of the ordinary. By giving players the unexciting but familiar as a starting point before they did anything at all, it made them feel like they were truly free, which in turn made Grand Theft Auto 3 the quintessential sandbox game. No matter how destructively or mundanely you decided to behave on a given day, Grand Theft Auto 3 was absolutely fine with it. The city was happy to keep ticking over, full of life but fairly dull, until you were ready to kick things up a gear. If you wanted to play Grand Theft Auto 3 like a video game, you could. There's nothing to stop you moving from mission to mission at record speed. If you didn't want to play the missions at all, no one was forcing you to either. When you did decide to interact with it, you were of course limited in the actions you were able to perform compared to real life, but that feeling that it was up to you to decide what you wanted to do, that the game is merely on hand to support whatever decision you made, was unparalleled. Liberty City was not an environment that threw excitement or intrigue at the player from the moment they entered it, but rather one which was exciting when the player chose for it to be, and that's an incredibly important distinction to make. We mustn't forget either that Grand Theft Auto 3 offered plenty to distract players outside of the city itself, which served to make it feel more alive, but also unfortunately, more like a video game. You could search for hidden packages, spend time hunting down all the different ramps dotted around the city, or snip out the different rampage pickups. Or, if you fancied something more structured, you could take a side job, becoming either a cab driver, a firefighter, a cop, or a paramedic, or a combination of all three of them. The genius of Grand Theft Auto 3's world, however, ultimately doesn't come from all these extra activities you can take part in, or even the main missions themselves. It comes from the fact the city is, like the ones many of us know, indifferent to your existence, unless you choose otherwise. There have been plenty of games that have since taken the foundations 3 laid and continued to build on them, most notably later games in the Grand Theft Auto franchise itself, but only 3 has the title of being the game that started it all. It was the first title that truly demonstrated to gamers how an environment that on the surface seemed unexciting, one rooted firmly in the ordinary, could perhaps be the most exciting of them all. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch the video, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider subscribing, it would make my day, and hopefully I'll see you all again soon.